welcome to FICO's Expert Spotlights. I'm Sarah Rutherford from FICO's product marketing team, and today I'm talking to Szymon Morytko, one of our fraud prevention experts. Szymon, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at FICO.
Hi, I'm Szymon Morytko. I'm part of the global team of fraud domain experts. Now, my role mainly focuses on working with financial institutions across the globe, understanding their pain points, what are some of the emerging threats they're facing, and then working together on solving these challenges, whether that's through enhancements to strategy management, making some of the operational processes better, or perhaps looking at new innovative solutions that they can deploy with us as well. Personally, I come from a banking background. I used to look after transactional fraud at NatWest in the UK, and I've spent the last few years working with clients across the globe, really focusing on how do we combat this threat of scams a lot better. And so happy to bring in insights, obviously, of what I've gathered from working across various different territories.
Thanks, Szymon. So today we're talking about the Third Payment Services Directive, or PSD3, and among other things that PSD3 looks to tackle, it's looking at the issue of scams, where a person's tricked into sending money to a fraudster. So how is PSD3 looking to tackle scams?
Sure, no problem. So obviously very much a welcome regulation. I think that clarity has been sought after from the EU in terms of that regulation around scams. And what's encouraging to see is obviously that it's building upon what PSD2 has introduced already in terms of strong customer authentication and things like that. But I think what I would probably do is classify some of the key themes within PSD3 into four key areas. So number one, which is all about that strong fraud prevention. Things like real-time monitoring are no longer nice to have. It's a requirement and something that's mandatory for all institutions, and that applies to both scams as well as more traditional third-party fraud elements as well. And so any institutions which don't do that yet today in terms of that real-time monitoring is something that they will have to focus on moving forward. Beyond that, I've touched on the strong customer authentication, and that's being expanded as part of this regulation. We're looking at how EU is indicating that various additional authentication mechanisms should come into play for that, and that broadening that SCA not just down to the mobile channels, but going beyond that and into any other channels that might be a preference for some consumers who don't necessarily want to or trust the mobile channels as the main point of authentication. And I think that the other critical one within this theme is the flexible and dynamic customer alerts. That movement away from generic kind of warnings, generic messages, into something that's more tailor-made. That's going to be a requirement from the financial institutions. Moving down from that, we've got provisions focused on the liability shift. And so that was an interesting one. And I think a lot of banks were on the edge of their seat to see what's that going to entail. And we've seen provisions within the PSD3 for banks and payment services providers to reimburse customers who have been victims of scams, but only if it's an impersonation scam where customers duped by somebody pretending to be from their bank or the PSP and guiding them through that scam event. So, a step in the right direction. Whether that goes far enough or not, I think we'll see over the coming years. Beyond that, expanded data sharing. So something that's obviously a big sticking point when it comes to scam prevention is I, as a financial institution, don't necessarily have all the right information in front of me to make an informed decision. And so provisions for more data sharing between banks, between different institutions, especially around potential fraudulent IBANs, manipulation techniques used, or sort of any sort of blacklists, etc. That's being introduced as something that obviously overcomes some of the GDPR constraints, if it's used specifically for fraud prevention reasons, which again, very much a welcome change. And the last one, an interesting one, is kind of more focused on the consumer empowerment aspect of scam prevention. and that's to do with what we see as confirmation of payee, something that's already in place in the UK, countries like Netherlands as well, and that's effectively the IBAN or name matching process. So when I'm making a payment to you, Sarah, for the first time, the bank will do the necessary checks to make sure that I am actually sending money to somebody who claims to be Sarah Rutherford and not somebody else. And so that's being introduced across the EU, not just for instant payments, but all transfers regardless of speed or currency.
Oh, thank you, Simon. I look forward to getting that first payment. So PSD3 is taking a robust approach to scams prevention, and banks are going to have to take action. So what should they be doing right now to better control fraud and comply with the regulation?
Cool. So I like to look at scam prevention as a kind of a three-step process. So step number one is obviously all about detecting the event itself. And so what we've seen as quite effective across the globe so far is kind of a combination of the different tools that the banks rely on to identify a potential scam event. That includes things like consortium-based scam models. So, we're very much used to consortium-based third-party fraud models, especially across cards, credit and debit card type consortium models. But what we're seeing more and more prominent now in the fight against scams is these consortium-based scam-focused models, which allow you to, have a model that's very much focused on this gray area of something that sits between what looks fairly genuine, but it doesn't quite look like a traditional fraud event. And so, effective tools like that, combined with what's becoming more and more common across various institutions, which is, let's say I've got a team of analysts, team of data scientists who are building out these models, who are trying to leverage a lot of this customer information I've got readily available to me in-house, but I don't necessarily have the tools to build and deploy a model that's that can be effectively operationalized within my decisioning flow. And so we're seeing that as something that's becoming more and more custom built by our customers, where they develop these models, such as, a good example of that would be a customer vulnerability score, where I classify customers into different segments, give them a score based on the likelihood of them falling a victim of scams, based on sort of historical data available to me, and then using that information as part of my transactional decisioning flow. And that's becoming quite effective. And then I think that the kind of the third layer to that, money mules, obviously the tool through which fraudsters cash out by making that money movement across, not just within the bank, but across different institutions quite quickly. And so profiling capabilities that target money mules are becoming quite critical as well, not just in terms of profiling of the beneficiaries and the destination accounts, but also looking at the broader picture and things like network analysis tools that help identify criminal networks, and something that can then be used in combination with law enforcement to actually go out and tackle that problem at root source. And I think down from that, if you think about the fight against scams, I could have a lot of that information readily available to me in-house, but I don't necessarily see the full picture. And so what we see as more and more effective is ability to go out to different service providers, go out to different data sets that are perhaps residing outside of my institution, and use that information as part of decisioning as well. A couple of examples to kind of highlight here maybe is, in Brazil, central bank has developed this tool that's effectively used by banks within the country for sharing a wide set of information about the potential scam orchestrators, mule accounts, previous victims of scams, etc. Information that can help you make a better decision when you're evaluating the transaction that's coming through. And another good example of that is UK, which is leading the pack in that collaboration with telcos. And what we've seen as quite effective is what we call the scam signal, which is effectively your ability to utilize some of the information within the API that's available on the telecom end, and be able to look at things and indicators that are happening on the customer's mobile, such as, when that customer is speaking to me, are they on an active call to somebody else at the same time, which could be a good indication of them being coached through various events by the scammer, or have they been on a phone to somebody else for a lengthy period of time just before they were making that payment, which again could be them getting coached by the scammer to execute that transaction. And so that's been seen as quite effective in that fight against scams. But all of these tools, they mean nothing if we can't actually convince the customer that they shouldn't proceed with that payment. And so that shift in how we actually communicate with customers and how we try to help them identify potential red flags about this specific transaction being part of a scam event has become, probably the biggest challenge in that fight against scams. And so that movement away from more traditional way of verification, where I just send you a message, confirm yes or no, is that you making a payment, has moved to something that's a lot more targeted, more custom in terms of that communication journey, where I perhaps ask open-ended questions and expect answers from customers, which then help me satisfy that this payment is probably legit, or allow me to potentially step up and maybe direct that customer to somebody who's more specialized within my fraud operations, who's able to talk them through various events that are happening right now and actually help break that spell of the scammer.
Thank you for that insight, Simon. So the EU is not the only region where fraudsters have taken advantage of real-time payment schemes. So what examples of good fraud prevention have you seen that EU banks could learn from?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of countries which are sort of leading the pack on the regulation front, and actually the impact it's already having on scam prevention. And so, UK is an interesting use case where we've seen them make the first move. And there's a couple of important pieces of regulation that were deployed within that, which includes things like 100% reimbursement to victims of scams, obviously unless there's evidence of collusion happening there. But every customer who has been a victim of a scam can expect to be reimbursed for that up to a certain amount within the UK. Now, EU doesn't necessarily go as far with that regulation, and that's not to say that they will ever go as far, but it's quite likely that this whole shift in regulation within the EU, as it pertains to just impersonation scams, where the scammer is impersonating the bank, could be kind of breaking of the ice event where more of the expansion of that liability shift will happen over the coming years. And the other one that's interesting that isn't necessarily factored within the PSD3 regulation is the liability shift, what we call the 50-50 split in the UK. So in an event of a scam, the liability for who's reimbursing that money back to the customer is split 50-50 between the originating and the recipient bank. And the intent behind that is all about trying to encourage the recipient banks to have stronger controls in place around preventing opening of money mules, opening accounts which are the intent is to use them to facilitate money movement, but also to encourage more of that profiling of inbound traffic, and not just the money that's going out of the account. And so, again, the EU's PSD3 doesn't cover that. However, there have been hints from EU around encouraging banks to profile more incoming transactions. Again, something that I personally read as potential hints of what's to come down the line as well. Now, another one that's worth paying attention to is Australia, which has already started to see reduction in the levels of scams and the amount of money being lost to scams, and that's on the back of various provisions that they've been deploying in terms of regulation, as well as that cross collaboration between banks. But I think what's interesting is the breadth of the regulation that they've deployed. So if you look at kind of the key principles within what's being outlined, it will cover everything all the way from governance through prevention, detection, down to response that's expected, but not just from banks, but telecom services, insurance providers, broadcasting services, and also, most importantly, I think, is the big tech companies, including social media networks. And so, very much interesting kind of approach, obviously, and they want to make sure that they tackle the problem head on with the breadth that it needs to take. But I think what's going to be interesting to see is how that all plays out in terms of the specific rules and requirements for each of these different sectors, which is still to come. So that will be interesting how that develops over time. And obviously, again, EU doesn't necessarily look at that cross-industry regulation yet in terms of that PSD3, but it will be interesting to see how that develops over time as well within EU.
Thanks, Simon. That's great advice for all of our EU banks out there, and I look forward to talking to you more on future expert spotlights.
Thank you. Likewise. Thanks very much.